Okay, our next super chat here is from David Bond for $10. Thank you very much for the super chat. I have some interest in the question of usury. Ooh, complicated question. How common was interest in the ancient Near East around the time of the Pentateuch? Actually, quite common. It does seem to have been practiced across several cultures. Were the Israelites unique in their standards regarding it? Okay. Not really. And the question of usury seems to often boil down to. Well, actually, you know what? I think we'll take the next few questions because we're going to cover all of it, I think. So we're going to take the next couple super chats as well. He also asks for a $5 super chat. Again, thank you. Was the injunction against usury a blanket ban or just in reference to a particular circumstance? Yes. In a sense, yes. Was it over and beyond extortion? Yes. Jesus' admonitions, Luke 6:35. Does the parable of the talents have any bearing? No. We'll get into the reason why. And his final one here is for $10. Thank you again for the super chat. Would the changing of this doctrine of interest in usury for the church be more permissive, be analogous to changing other doctrines based on changing circumstance of culture or economics? Yes, that too. Okay. A lot of issues here. But we're going to try to take these kind of swallow the elephant whole here. Because if we swallow the elephant whole here, it makes, we're going to be touching on a whole lot of other things here at once, okay? Now, there is records of interest being charged for lending things, not just money. We have to understand that money was, a lot of what we understand as interest today is part of that fiat currency economy. Now, fiat currency was not something you had in the Bronze Age. So people didn't have money back then. They basically bought things by weight of metals or by barter. Okay. So when money was lent in the days of the Pentateuch, it was often lent as a weight of a metal. So the standard that the Israelites used had to go with the circumstances of the people you were lending it to. If you were lending it to a brother, fellow tribes member, fellow clan member, there was this expectation that you were not going to try to make a profit on their suffering. Okay? Because there's an injunction to, there's also a general prohibition, or at least an ethic within the Old Testament, not to borrow. So people didn't borrow frivolously. They aren't whipping out a credit card here and buying a big screen TV. Okay? They're borrowing by necessity. They're borrowing because their crops failed and they need money to get new seed and to survive. So that's a lot of the circumstances that underlied Bronze Age borrowing. Okay? So instead of there being welfare, you would borrow from your neighbor to make it through the winter. Basically, if you lost everything and if the next spring wasn't good and you couldn't pay back that debt, you had to sell yourself into slavery. So the consequences of this are particularly dire. So if you lent your neighbor and you charged them exorbitant interest, that contributed to how quickly somebody ended up being enslaved. At least until the year of Jubilee. Now, this prohibition did not extend to, say, the Gentile. Because there wasn't the same sort of consequences for lending it to the Gentile. They didn't own land. So there's a difference here between the circumstances that's involved. So the Israelites were unique in that respect, that you were not supposed to charge exorbitant interest. Now, with the invention of fiat currencies, and inflation, money doesn't retain its value. So there's that other aspect of this as well, which is that economies themselves have changed since the Bronze Age. Okay, so we're going to flip back to this one here. So we just covered that previous super chat. So it does reference the circumstance, okay? Because nobody would be, I mean, a poor person would not be lending to a rich person. It'd be just, a person of, say, maybe means, or maybe of your neighbor lending to someone who's in worse circumstances than you. So that's the general situation under which these lending laws apply. Yeah, it was over and beyond extortion in that you're taking advantage of somebody's dire circumstances that they may not be able to pay off. As far as the parable of the talents, is basically a master, giving money to his servants to use on his behalf. Those servants don't own the money, and they're not lending the money. They're being sent with a purpose in mind. Okay? So it's sort of apples and oranges here to the whole issue of usury. Okay? So the parable of talents does not apply. So it's not that the master in the king in the parable of talents is lending money that people are asking for, but more along the lines that they are being given an allocation to use for the purposes of the master. The intent is to invest. The intent is to take risks. The intent is to generate more money from the money you're given. Okay? So, and ultimately it acts as a test. Test to see if you're a faithful and good servant. So, it's not the same as what's going on with the usury laws. So with that said, in today's economy where money loses its value every year, you can't use, say, a replacement theory like you could back then. Back then, someone loans you 100 shekels of silver. All you have to do is be able to gather 100 shekels of silver back, and you've repaid the loan in full. That currency has not diminished anything in value because what you lended was a physical item, not the perceived value behind the item. Now, kind of not true, it's stretching a point here, but same thing, somebody lends you 3 bags of grain. You return 3 bags of grain, paid in full. Those bags of grain aren't worth less when you return it than when you were loaned it. It's not true with fiat currency. Fiat currencies become less valuable the more you mint of it. The more you make fiat currencies, they become less valuable. Inflation. So every year, a fiat currency is going to become less and less valuable. Unless you have deflation, and that has its own horrors. So, in the case of fiat currencies, often when like, for example, if you loan somebody, say, $100, and he pays you back $105, okay, whether or not he had to, oftentimes for tax purposes, that's not considered to be a profit because of the amount of inflation involved. You're actually getting back the value of the money when you lent it. So in a lot of states, a 5% or less lending rate is sometimes not considered to be usury or making a profit through lending. There was a time when a good friend lended me $2,000 to make it through my doctoral degree, essentially, because we were short on cash. And when I returned the money, I added a 5% premium because, I understand that, if I didn't do this, I wouldn't be paying it back value in kind. So I voluntarily added more to my repayment of the loan, just because I was paying full value back. That's not, even though it's technically lending with interest, it's not usury. Because usury is making a profit at the expense of somebody else. Covering the costs of inflation is not taking advantage of anyone. It's restoring what the lender gave you. So that's one of those changes in economics, culture, that sort of thing, that will affect how we view, say, interest and usury. Okay? So, wrapping all this up, okay? It is highly based, the whole doctrine of usury and interest is highly based upon circumstances. You know, are you lending to somebody who's wealthy? Are you lending to someone who's poor? Is the consequence of them not paying it back? Is that going to end them up? Are you going to end up enslaving a brother as a result? Is it going to end up where, if interest isn't charged, that the lender is going to, take advantage of the lendee? The person who gives the loan, is he, you as a person who's lending something, you can't hide behind the doctrine of interest just to pay less in value in the future. Because that's a form of theft too. We have to realize that's a form of theft, where people may lend a bunch of money and pay it back at the original value that they lent it, original denomination of the sum that they originally lent, and said, hey, okay, 20 years later, it's paid in full. You lent me $1,000 20 years ago, I paid you back $1,000 now, so we're done. Yeah, that money's changed a lot in value in 20 years. It's probably worth half of what it was originally. So that can be a kind of theft too. So this doctrine can get really complex real fast. And you've asked a lot of questions on it, and we've tried to cover it all by, as I said, trying to eat the elephant whole here. So anyway, with that said, thank you very much for all those super chats. I hope we covered this adequately. It's a complex topic with a lot of economic and historical factors involved here. So anyway, thank you very much for those super chats and those questions, and very, very much appreciated.